That's what you want, isn't it? To be mine. Forever.
Even in undeath, we do not part. For to love a vampire forever, one must live forever. One must be
Aeterna Amantes. Lovers forever. Until the world falls down.
One of the biggest debates among the Astarion fan base has always been if Ascended Astarion honestly loves us, followed by if we're truly his slave. So this is your trigger warning for the video. We're about to go full book talk, dark romance girly up in here. The versions of love we're going to be discussing are going to contain elements of control, manipulation, uninformed consent, and possibly dark situations. If you're someone who thinks that dark romance romanticizes toxic relationships, well then this video is likely going to upset you, so you've been warned. But if you love the fantasy of morally gray men and villainous men dominating their love interest, then you're in the right place, babe. But before we dive in, be sure to drop an emoji in the comments below. If you're a spawn girly, give us a flower, because my baby girl would cover our bed in rose petals on a random Wednesday just for fun. But if you're an ascended girly, give us a black heart emoji, because only a true vampire can love their dark consort forever. Also, in this video, we're going to be talking about intimacy between two adults, which means to appease the YouTube overlords and not have a million censor beeps, I'm going to be replacing any XXX terms with the word spicy. Thank you for understanding. Quick side note, we're his dark consort, not courtesan. So despite sounding similar, a consort is not a mistress or a concubine. According to the Royal Collection Trust, which has the same definition as the Forgotten Realms does for their gods' consorts, a consort is the title of a wife or a husband of a monarch who has no constitutional power in the royal courts. Using this term in Baldur's Gate 3 was a way to have a non-gendered title. But in Ravenloft, the term vampire bride is gender neutral, and it's given to anyone who goes through the ceremony. It's also mainly done romantically, but it does not have to be romantic specific. There are instances in which cis-het men have turned other cis-het men into vampire brides. So, for the sake of staying true to the lore, I'm going to be saying vampire bride and not dark consort. As Jahira says, the only thing a vampire can feel is hunger. And this is true, but it's in a way that's beyond merely bloodlust. As Raphael said, Cazador would be able to enjoy the appetites of man again if he fully ascended. Vampires in D&D are driven by all forms of hunger. That's hunger for blood, hunger for control, hunger for a spicy arrival, and most of all, hunger for power. As Astarion says in one of his dialogue branches,
Vampires are power-hungry creatures. They won't lose a servant to create a competitor.
So make no mistakes here, Astarion does not make you a true vampire in the way that Cazador is one, even though he gave you his blood. But he also doesn't make you a spawn. But don't worry, we'll dive into why I'm saying that. What Astarion has done to you is much more insidious, but also darkly romantic. Keep in mind, there are countless forms of vampires in the Forgotten Realms. Baldur's Gate 3 is a Wizards of the Coast game, and Wizards of the Coast are the creators of the Forgotten Realm campaigns. I'll be referencing materials from Ravenloft a lot in this video. It's important that you know Ravenloft is part of the Forgotten Realms. It's a branch of books and campaigns that are solely horror, dark fantasy, and paranormal based. But it is 100% canon to the Forgotten Realms, and thus Baldur's Gate 3. In the Forgotten Realms, there are over 30 types of vampiric creatures. They range from dampires, who are half vampires, to vampire direwolves, to spawn, and even to drider vampires. Some are rare, like the drider vampire. Others, while not rare, haven't been changed or updated in materials in over a decade, like the vampire drow. These different variations, they all require a very unique way to turn. Having various breeds of vampires isn't unheard of. It can even be a major story plot point, like Klaus in the Vampire Diaries and his hybrids. Or it can just be a way to flesh out variations in abilities within a universe, which is something I've played with in my own writing. But in D&D, vampires are unique in that their most popular vampire, the true vampire, creates spawn, who are essentially meat puppets that when given a command, they cannot fight against it. Think about compelling in the most modern vampire fiction. You can't resist the command they give you unless you have the power to control your own mind or a tool. Spawn are much the same, except that they're trapped in their own bodies. Despite Astarion calling us his most treasured spawn, we are not. We're under his control, just not in the way that you would think. To understand what a vampire bride is, we need to go back to the very first vampire. Welcome back to 2009, when Open Grave, a Dungeons & Dragons guide to the undead, hit the scene. Here, we met the very first vampire of the Forgotten Realms, Strahd van Zarovich. He wasn't the first vampire to be seen, he's just the actual beginning of vampires. To quote him from the book The Tome of Strahd, "He is the ancient, he is the lamp, he is the beginning, lost in the darkness of the past. Not dead, not alive, but undead forever." Strahd is mainly featured in Ravenloft materials. Although some of the main Forgotten Realms materials mention him and his bride, the meat and potatoes of the ceremony is mostly going to come from Ravenloft. According to the Curse of Strahd, Strahd fell in love with a human, Tatiana. He sold his soul to the dark powers of the Shadowfell, dragging his city of Bravonia into the domains of Dread, an area in the deepest corners of the Shadowfell. Tatiana was the love of his life, but it was unrequited. His obsession drove him into a pact, and as punishment, he was cursed with eternal life and an endless hunger and obsession for the sins of the flesh. Power, spice, and blood. Tatiana was punished by being trapped in Bravonia, being reincarnated over and over again. Each time, Strahd would claim her as his again, keeping her against her will in his eternal embrace. In the Curse of Strahd, we see the first implications of the vampire bride. She was in love with Sergei, Strahd's brother. He killed his brother and drank his blood in front of her to seal his deal with darkness and make her his bride forever. On her fucking wedding day. In a fit of loss and rage, Tatiana threw herself off the cliffs around the castle Ravenloft, falling to her doom in the valleys below. Centuries later, one of her reincarnations was able to escape the obsessive control of her lover Strahd. She was able to escape into Waterdeep, taking on the form of a woman named Anna, who was locked up for insanity. However, a rival vampire, Jander Sunstar, found her and fell madly in love with her himself. Although she didn't age, she did fall sick, and not wanting to see her suffer, Jander drank every last drop of her blood. According to Vampires of the Mists and the Villain's Lore book, this connected them forever, and he left to find who had cursed her. According to the Curse of Strahd, Tatiana was reincarnated again, this time as a woman named Aeterna Amantes. And diving into the world Anvil, dedicated to Bravonia, the universe around Strahd and Bravonia, Count Strahd had been attempting to perfect the vampire bride ceremony. Now, before we can explain the vampire bride more, it's important to dismiss any disillusions you have of Tav becoming a spawn. According to the Monster Manual, Volume 3.5, the ritual to create a vampire spawn goes as follows. Step 1. A vampire must use its bite to take the player down to 0 points, because death is required for this process. Step 2. The victim must immediately be buried. Immediately does have some variations depending on campaigns in your DM, but it generally consists of being within the first few hours of death. Step 3. A soul who is strong enough to accept the darkness without fully shattering will resurrect. They must then break their coffin and dig their way to the surface. This is why after biting you, Astarion tells you to be grateful that he's not a true vampire. If he were, and he had killed you while biting you, he could bury you and raise you as his spawn. And now, as much as I love Starry, he 100% would have made you his spawn if he could have. At this point in the story, when he first bites you, he's looking to seduce you to manipulate your feelings so you'll never turn on him. So he would have taken your consent and control at this point without a second thought. And honestly, I don't blame him. If I was in the same position, I'd have done whatever it took to protect myself from Cazador too. So, given that we're not buried, it's not possible for us to be a true spawn. And remember, Larian is very thorough. they don't do anything unintentionally. So if they'd wanted to make us a spawn, we'd have had a cutscene climbing out of the grave, or we would have mentioned it. Especially given that if you keep Astarion a spawn, he tells you how he transformed in his graveyard scene. So they're fully aware, and they also intended for us to know that Ascended Astarion did something completely different to us. Also, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to give it a like so I know that you want more content like this. It honestly helps me decide what the next release should be. Alright, so now that you understand the background information that you need, let's dive into what you're really here for: the Vampire Bride. According to the Bravonian World Anvil, which is a database of saved lore for world building, it's a goldmine for DMs and writers, and also a really great resource for yourself if you're a writer. According to the Anvil, the bride ceremony is done by a vampire when they wish to transform someone into a vampire. The ceremony bypasses the vampire spawn stage and converts them into a full vampire, allowing them free will but maintaining the link between both parties. I know what you're thinking. What is this link? Well, it's the sire link. Link is what makes a vampire spawn feel indebted to their master and keeps them bound to said master. So while yes, a vampire bride is technically a true vampire, they're also still bound to their master for eternity. They're not a puppet to said master's commands, but they'll also never break that mental, physical, or emotional bond. You're literally an eternal couple. Again, this coupling doesn't have to be romantic, so a vampire could have multiple brides, but typically they'll only have one love or mate. This is because vampires experience love differently than other humanoids, including spawn. Love for a vampire is often twisted and corrupted by their undead nature and darkness. Their love becomes possessive, obsessive, and a fixation on whatever it was that made them desire their mate in the first place. And keep in mind, when I say someone is your mate, I mean the emotional connection, not the physical connection of only having spices with one person. Astarion fell in love with us for the support and dedication that we gave him in his story quest. He's not in love with our appearance or our body, but for who we are. And that's why if you become a mind flayer, he breaks up with you. Because mind flayers lose their soul and they stop being themselves, even if they hold on to their old host's memories like the Emperor does. So logically, when ascended, Astarion still loves that about us. His love will become a twisted obsession with us loving him forever, supporting him forever, and caring for his needs forever. Listen to the choice of words he makes when he's trying to manipulate you into becoming a vampire.
I can't believe you let me do that. Killing all those people. A pleasant surprise. I want what's best for you too, of course. That's what you want, isn't it? To be mine. Forever. You wouldn't just be some spawn. You're far more than that to me. My dark consort. My right hand. My most beloved. Shall we have one last night together before you join me in immortality?
See, he's following his original path to winning us over. Seduction, calling upon our dedication to him, and then finalizing our connection by giving us in return exactly the love we wanted. Astarion outright warns us what he's going to do.
Tonight, I shall drink every drop of your blood, own your body, kill your mind. It will only hurt a bit. The pleasure will be far greater than the pain. Thank you for trusting me. You were drained dry, and at the height of your delirium, I granted you one drop of my own blood. Things will be a touch different for you than they were for me when I was a spawn. I'm imbued with unfathomable new talents. I'm fairly certain I can extend Mephistopheles' blessings unto you. You will be stronger, swifter, sharper. But you won't be different. You're already perfect before. It's hard to improve. I wish we could retreat into our palace already and spend a decade in each other's arms. Spawn is an ugly word. I really do prefer consort. Don't you worry. You have supped of my blood. It will be no trouble to extend a fragment of my protection to you. Just don't stray too far. But you'd never dream of doing that, would you?
But as we're uninformed on the meeting, we're still uninformed in our consent. A vampire bride is technically a true vampire in the powers that they have, but they're not really a true vampire. That's why they have a different creature name, because they're still bound to their master like a spawn, not physically, but emotionally. Their dark souls are united forever. Tav really is his right hand, his most beloved, his eternal mate. But Tav is also something between a spawn and a true vampire. He even outright uses the term dark consort, which to a vampire means something, but to a non-vampire, it probably just sounds like a pet name. When you tell him you want to be a true vampire, he tells you that you will be in time.
And you will. All in good time. But we mustn't rush these things. You may need time to adjust.
And he isn't lying. As your bond with him grows post-turning, you'll come more and more into your powers. And there will come a time when Tav has all of what makes someone a true vampire, except they'll never be able to love, couple, connect with anyone except for Astarion. Even if you were to break up with Astarion as Tav, it wouldn't last forever. You'd reach a point where that obsession that's literally seared into your dark soul would drag you back into his arms. You truly gave him forever. Just like Tatiana, you will never escape Astarion. Even if he were to turn fully evil, Tav would still be incapable of not loving him. However, keep in mind, he's influenced by your soul now too, so if your Tav isn't evil, you would be able to balance him out. As well, it's important to note that the bride ceremony makes bound vampires incapable of truly hurting each other. Unlike Spawn, you now have linked souls. You feel with each other, you think with each other. Your pain, in a way, is his pain. It isn't like, oh, you stub your toe and now he feels it, but it's more like if your soul was in agony, physical or emotional torment, his would be too. He wouldn't be able to hurt you the way that Cazador hurts him. But he could hurt others. Or you could become twisted and hurt others yourself. To bind souls is the ultimate form of eternal love. But doing so without Tav knowing what they're signing up for? It's insidious. Darkly, beautifully romantic, but insidious nonetheless. So, how do I know we're a vampire bride? Well, that's simple. The way Astarion turns us, it follows the bride ceremony. Step 1. To complete the bride ceremony, a vampire must drink from their victim 3 times in the night of the change. Astarion bites us for the first time right before we hook up. Astarion bites us for the second time after we get on our knees and he pushes us down to the ground. Depending on if you say make it hurt or be gentle, he'll bite your wrist or your neck. I always ask to make it hurt, and I'm not sorry. The final bite, it comes in the form of your neck as the narrator explains that you are slipping into unconsciousness. Step 2. On the final bite, the vampire master must drink the blood of almost all of your body. Typically, they'll leave just enough so you're not dead, but take enough that your mind dies. Astarion literally warns you in those exact words. That's what he's going to be doing to you.
Tonight, I shall drink every drop of your blood, own your body, kill your mind.
Step 3. The vampire must give you their blood. According to the bride ceremony, the victim must drink the vampire blood. However, this drink from the vampire can be extremely addicting, so the vampire must maintain control over the victim's drinking to prevent them from drinking too much or too little. If the victim drinks too much or too little, then the victim will die an excruciating death. This is why Astarion tells us the next morning that he gave us 1 drop of his blood. If you listen here, he lays out exactly what he did in step 3.
You were drained dry, and at the height of your delirium, I granted you 1 drop of my own blood.
A fun fact about the bride ceremony: it doesn't hurt the way that becoming a spawn does. In fact, the person feels immense pleasure. There's a deep significance in this ceremony. It's an eternal soul bond, a marriage of the minds, if you will. There's nothing more intimate a vampire can do with another living creature. And if you have spicy times prior to or even during the ceremony, it makes the coupling eternally romantic. It makes you their mate. This is why him biting us in this scene, it doesn't say it was a shard of ice or we felt numbness as we faded like it does in the first bite scene. It's because we're enjoying this. As we've laid out, Astarion walks us through all of the steps of the vampire bride ceremony. He even names us his dark consort. Again, a consort in D&D being the spouse of a god without political power. He couldn't make himself any more clear, if you know what you're looking for. I'm addicted to vampires. I've been obsessed with Ravenloft for a very long time. I also have my first degree in cultural anthro, and it focuses on mythology, so I've also studied vampires for a very long time. My second degree is in English, so I also write about them. And the Vampire Bride in Ravenloft, it isn't original. There have been vampire brides for nearly as long as the vampire mythos has existed, and almost every other vampire-adjacent myth has also had something similar. So I recognized it instantly the first time that I ascended him, and I loved every single moment of it. So yes, without a single doubt in my mind, no hung juries, Astarion made us a vampire bride. If you really love vampires and the idea of the vampiric bond, I suggest you jump into Christy Gould's Ravenloft The Covenant series, starting with Book 1, Vampires of the Mists. This happens to be the story of Jonder Sunstar that we talked about earlier. I've also dabbled in vampire bonds in my current series, The Gemstone Souls, Book 1, Infinity's Touch. It does get spicy. But if you really love spicy books, Sadie Kincaid has an amazing and honestly a really unique take on vampire bonding in her series Broken Bloodlines, starting with Book 1, Forged in Blood. I'm actually in the middle of reading this series right now, and I absolutely love it, and I love her, even though she's not going to see this. I'll have all these books linked in the description. Just know that my books and Sadie's books are poly romances, and they do contain queer romances with spicy scenes, so they're absolutely intended for adult audiences. And before I go, I wanted to say thank you so much for being here. Gaming and writing, they're my passions. And with subscribers like you, I'm able to share those passions and connect with other people outside of what I do as a day job. So hopefully I will see you all next time, my darlings.
And now you're all mine. And I'm all yours. Until morning, at least.